Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And it's time for a tier list. I'm going to tier out the studio album discography of the one, the only progressive rock outfit, the Mars Volta, one of the most significant progressive rock bands of my lifetime, anyway. And we are going to go through the core records of their discography from De-Loused to Nocturniquet. I hope you guys are familiar with the band, and if you're not, please, I guess, use this video to maybe get an idea as to where to start with some of their stuff. Because as some of you may know, progressive rock isn't exactly the most outsider-friendly genre, and that can be especially true for the Mars Volta, whose music over the years has really warranted a lot of strong, polarizing opinions. Like, they've notoriously received some of the most positive and also most negative reviews in their genre. And it doesn't really get much better when you're kind of digging beyond the critics and looking at stuff like user reviews on Rate Your Music. I mean, a lot of the takes are like, oh, this is a masterpiece. Every album's a masterpiece. Each one is a masterpiece in its own way. And then meanwhile, there are people that just become physically ill at the idea of even listening to a Mars Volta record. Bam! Oh, it's gigantic. Here we go. Cover art to the band's first record dropped in 2003. Now, because the Mars Volta rose out of the ashes of At the Drive-In in so many ways, the band kind of came to us fully formed and didn't really have that awkward period at the start that many groups do where they're like really trying to figure their shit out and find out what direction to go in and what to do and how to sound and how to write songs. Cedric and Omar just really had a clear idea as to what they wanted to do with the band. They carried over a lot of those like post-hardcore influences from their last group and just started carrying them out in a more progressive fashion on this LP over here. The songs on this record are grand, they're multi-phased, they are intense, they are loaded with technical and very flashy, impressive musicianship, but from front to back, it's an incredibly visceral LP. This is not the kind of progressive wankery that you sort of just, lay back to and it just washes over you. No, this is a record that like forces you to engage with it because it's so energetic, it's so in your face. There are some points, and maybe this is because of how I feel about works later in their discography, where I feel like it could be pushed further. I think the band could have gone a little harder on this record, just a tad bit. On top of it, I think Cedric's vocals didn't quite hit the eccentric stride that they would on later releases. But still, with that being said, this album is a very great balance of progressive rock instrumentation, direct, exciting, visceral rock songwriting. If you can't get into this LP or at least appreciate where the band is coming from, like their sound, their style, it annoys you, it bugs you, it irks you, I have a feeling it'll be even harder to get into later releases. So, this record might be a good one just to find out generally, like, is Mars Volta the band for you? They may not be, and if not, that's fine. All around, I think this is a very solid LP. Not my favorite Mars Volta, but still well-produced, well-written, well-performed, tight. It could push boundaries a little bit further, but I still think it is a very good start to their discography. I would give it a solid high B. Now, following this, we have the 2005 album Bam, Francis the Mute. This is their second record, came out just 2 years after De-Loused. This is my personal favorite from the band. This, I think, is the highlight of their discography. And as far as modern progressive rock records go, this is easily in the top 10, if not the top 5. Like, the playing on here is immaculate, the grooves are so freaking tight, and the song lengths are just massive, and even though they're massive, they're just so gratifying from one phase to the next. It's all so fluid, so cohesive, so exciting. I also love all of the experimental, synth and psychedelic passages, the extended solos. Cedric is really just like in another world vocally, and what I like about this LP is that his vocals are so raw as well, not really diving too much into the heavy and sometimes grating effects that I'm going to talk about a little bit more on later releases. To me, this is the band really kind of at a writing and performance peak, at a creativity peak. It's so extravagant, it's so grand. It really does feel like the next logical step of progressive rock, really kind of their masterpiece in so many ways. And again, it's, I think, one of the best prog records of the modern era. I would put it in an S category. I don't really have an issue with not really a single track or moment off of it. I mean, I guess you could say some moments do drag on a little bit, some of the more abstract, sound play bits, but I kind of like that stuff, and it is complemented with really visceral, exciting rock passages throughout, and really great fusions with Latin music as well. I mean, Mars Volta are probably far from the first group to fuse Latin and prog, but surely with this LP being evidence, they're one of the best. So following this, we have the band's 2006 record, Amputechture. Here is the cover right here. I actually love this cover. I guess to kind of detour here for a little bit. I hate the De-Loused album cover. I hate that album cover. Like the bald head with the light coming out of it is so tacky to me. I do love the Francis the Mute album cover. I really do. But this one I find really pleasing between the color palette, and I like the kind of the shady picture of the guys with the statue head. It's a very curious kind of painting, and I like it quite a bit. I love this cover, but I don't necessarily love this album. It's not terrible, but it does have some severe shortcomings, especially coming off of Francis the Mute. Now, how I would characterize this record overall is that Mars Volta at this point in their career is still very much in an abstract, experimental pocket. This record is very out there. It's got a lot of strange winding song structures, a lot of long tracks. Unlike Francis the Mute, a lot of these tracks are not really all that cohesive or fluid. Not that I mind tracks that are all over the place, but moments like the intro as well as the lengthy tetragrammaton just feel kind of, I guess, disjointed in their assembly of passages, riffs, and grooves. The beauty of Francis the Mute is that no matter how long the tracks went, everything just felt so cohesive and together and complementary, and like everything was kind of carrying the momentum of past moments behind it. Whereas Amputechture, in many ways, just feels like so much more of a mess. Like it doesn't really have an idea of the direction compositionally it wants to go in. Now, I will say, this is not so much an issue on the back end of the LP. If there is any gold to be dug out of this record, which there is, it really kind of comes in the form of maybe the last 4 tracks on the record. That's where some of the most solid moments on the entire LP are. And I will say, like, a lot of the performances, when they are good on this LP, they're great. But as I was kind of alluding to earlier when talking about Francis the Mute, they do indulge a little bit more in some really obnoxious vocal effects with Cedric that I don't really kind of get the band's infatuation with these around this point in their career, because Cedric is already such a great standout vocalist with a ton of character, amazing range. His voice is going to pop in the mix regardless of what you do with it. Why you would want to process it to hell, like overlayer it, just pack it with so many like effects and bells and whistles is kind of beyond me. It's not really necessary, and it leads to a lot of spots on this LP that I find to be very grating, and I imagine to more uninitiated listeners just sound like totally annoying, and just I don't want to have anything to do with this. Like, as much as I do love some spots of this record, there are moments here that I really do skip, even though I do have a hell of a lot of respect for some of the experimental ambitions that Amputechture is trying to showcase. I would say it's an album that, once you've kind of acclimated yourself to some of the band's more listenable releases, maybe go back and try it. All right, next here we have the band's 4th full-length LP, Bedlam in Goliath, their 2008 record, where we see stylistically and compositionally a change of pace. This is not nearly as abstract or as long-winded in terms of song structure as Francis the Mute or as Amputechture. We have a lot of straightforward songs on here, relatively speaking. Mars Volta aren't like, extending up to 12 and 16 minutes on these tracks. This time it's 9 minutes and change at the most. So in a way they're toning it down, but in some ways they are totally, absolutely not. There is an intense, almost unbreakable energy to this record that lasts throughout most of the songs here. Like, the playing and the grooves on this thing are dizzying, to the point where it's almost difficult to stand, and they really start to go hard on Cedric's vocal effects. All the layering, all the processing, it's just difficult to listen to. It's really grating. Now, that's not to say that this thing isn't without its highlights. I think songs like Goliath, for example, are a show that Mars Volta are really kind of carrying that King Crimson torch into a new era, and doing so successfully, doing so really well. And look, even though the performances are so fiery that they kind of happen in a blur, they are still really good. So there are aspects of this album that I like, some real slappers in the track list for sure, some of the band's most hard-hitting and straightforward material so far. But overall, as an album experience, I'm kind of left just wanting more breathing room, wanting more tasteful, natural sounding vocals and instrumentation, something that doesn't essentially feel like an endless, brutal prog slugfest, which is why, as much as I do like some characteristics of this record, I do have to put it in the C category. Okay, next in our tier list, we have the band's 2009 record Octahedron, which among many fans is regarded to be one of the band's worst and least interesting, and I guess I could see that to a degree if you're looking at Mars Volta's narrative and overall progression in a certain way. Is Octahedron their most bold record? No. Is it their most daring and experimental record? No. As far as album lengths go, it's easily their shortest and most compact. You can tell in some respects they're not coming across nearly as ambitious as they have been in the past, and this record is easily one of the band's least intense. There are a lot of slow burners and a lot of ballads on this project, only a couple of tracks that are really truly like fiery. But with that being said, I like this one a lot. I like this one quite a bit. Maybe overall as an album experience, again, it doesn't have as many hard or heavy hitters as a Goliath might, but honest to God, I think that the production on this record is a lot more tasteful than it's been on the two previous Mars Volta albums. They toned it down a little bit, but Mars Volta toning it down at this point in their career isn't exactly like, going bland or going pop. It feels weird saying that this album is like their poppy record or their super accessible record or anything like that, because for Mars Volta, like, that's only a relative shade change. Like, they're so far beyond making a pop record at this point still that toning it down a little bit has only just kind of put them back into an accessibility level that of De-Loused, in my opinion. And I just think the instrumentation and production is a lot more natural, a lot more easy to kind of digest, more pretty, more well balanced. And even though the songs for the most part are a lot slower and more low key, they're still well written. They're still very cohesive and fluid. They're still anthemic. There are still many catchy parts to these tracks. Cedric gives some great vocal performances. And look, with this record being as short as it is, it doesn't really give the band a whole lot of room to kind of veer off in anything too, random or I guess uncomplimentary. So, I actually like this LP quite a bit. If you're willing to kind of sit down for an LP that's maybe a bit more of a mood LP. A lot of great qualities to it. Nothing really that I dislike about it too strong. It's just not their boldest, but I don't think a record needs to be their boldest in order for it to be good. It has solid production and songwriting, good instrumentation, and overall I think it's a well-assembled progressive rock record. Which brings us to the final album in the band's discography, Nocturniquet, came out in 2012. Boop, here it is. Now, you guys may know or have just noticed that this is the only album of theirs that I have reviewed on the channel. Liked it upon release. I still like it to this day. It's still a flawed album, though. I would say in many ways, this is the band's most straightforward LP. The songs and song lengths on this album are more compact than they are on any other Mars Volta record. But with that being said, though, kind of the major flaw of this LP is, there are a handful of duds in the track list songwriting-wise, but really, like, the production and dynamics are kind of whacked. There are so many passages to this record that sound kind of very trebly and sunburnt, just very odd assemblies of instrumentation EQ-wise as well. There are some tracks where that almost lends the album a somewhat wonky and experimental edge that's kind of cool, and there are others like the very lengthy In Absentia that sound frankly like a total mess, like I'm just listening to a sound exist in some kind of like metal box auditory abattoir where just instrumentation goes to die. But yeah, that's essentially my Mars Volta tier list over here. Let me know down in the comments what yours would be. Over here next to my head is another video you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, the Mars Volta, forever. Ooh.